Okay, so welcome back, everyone. We are in just another Global Foresight Summit session for this 2021 edition in collaboration with the APF and the World Futures Review. So in this session, we have with us Jenson Bennett. And Julie is a researcher, strategist, writer, and technologist. She is actually working with the School of International Future, or collaborating with the School of International Future. I'm not sure about that position. And she's going to be talking now during the next 45 minutes about this concept of the future as a legacy to the next generation. So how can we embed strategic foresight into decision-making through the lens of intergenerational fairness? So Julie, everything on your side. I leave the stage on you, and see you in a few minutes.
Great, thank you so much. Yes, I am Julie Jenson Bennett. I'm joining you from a very unseasonably warm and sunny London today to talk about intergenerational fairness in decision-making. And I am very aware that there are a lot of syllables on this slide that you're looking at. But hopefully over the next half hour, 40 minutes that we have to talk together, all of these syllables will begin to offer you a fresh lens on the question of kind of why we do foresight, and also inspire some very practical actions to help people use foresight in their everyday work. Now, I will warn you that this is a story that collides some of our deepest, most human hopes and fears for this world with a phrase that rarely stirs high emotions. And that is the term policy assessment methodology. But it turns out in this world and in this story that auditors can be superheroes too. As mentioned, I work with the School of International Futures. We're actually a nonprofit collective of practitioners doing policy, strategy, and planning for future generations. That means we work with global foundations, governments, and NGOs all around the world to help develop new thinking about systems and networks. SWAF training and retreats have introduced strategic foresight to well over 600 leaders from over 50 countries. We provide advice and advisory services to national governments, the United Nations, organizations all around the world on the use of foresight and strategy. So we've gone to as many, Switzerland, South Korea, Oman, Tunisia, Chile, Russia, to build capability and develop insight. And through our Next Generation Foresight Practitioners Program, we accelerate the work of emerging changemakers and activists who enable their communities to imagine and create their own futures collectively. And you'll have the opportunity to meet some of our NGFP fellows tomorrow, I believe. Now, across all of these activities, you'll notice the word foresight kind of very much unites our work across the collective. And that's also the word that brings us here together today. Right? We all share some interest in what might happen next. We've got this interest that causes us to spend a lot of our time in this place we call the future, or futures, doing all sorts of futuring things. And when other people ask us kind of like, oh, why do you do this strange thing? What use is the future to me? We generally say something like, oh, we look to the future to change the present, to change our actions. We think about tomorrow so we can make better decisions today. And then kind of mutually reassured that foresight can be both beautiful and useful, we carry on doing our futuring things. But I'd like to kind of dwell in that place just a little while longer today. You know, if we believe a better tomorrow starts with better decisions today, well, what do we mean by better? How is this foresight useful if we're not actually the ones making the important decisions? As individuals and societies, can we actually hold each other to account for both the short-term and the long-term consequences of the decisions that we're making? And how do we do this within political systems that are facing these continuous waves of overlapping crisis and a time of great uncertainty? These are not easy questions, and they don't end with a 20-minute conversation. But we do think that there is a very practical and urgent starting point to these questions. And that starting point is called intergenerational fairness. Now, intergenerational fairness is a phrase that you may or may not have heard before. It is actually a thing, a concept that's been around for quite a long time and surfaces in different communities in different ways. People come to it from different angles. You can think about intergenerational fairness in housing or in healthcare, pensions, transportation, COVID response, climate change. Whatever the issue you're looking at, when you think about intergenerational fairness, you're examining how the consequences and the costs of those decisions will be experienced differently across time. In our practice, we think about intergenerational fairness in terms kind of defined by the Brundtland Commission report on sustainable development in 1987. And so we say a decision is intergenerationally fair. There are a lot of syllables, I warned you. When it allows people of all ages to meet their needs, and it meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So, in other words, intergenerational fairness gives us a way to negotiate the needs between people who are alive today and people who will live in the future. Now, this is an idea that most people agree with around the world from different cultural, religious, political traditions. No matter where we start on the socioeconomic ladder, we want our children to prosper. We generally want them to do better than ourselves. We want to leave a legacy for the future. We want to be the good ancestor and not the bad ancestor. And we also want to live out the last years of our lives secure in the knowledge that at our most vulnerable, we will be cared for. These things are easy to say and much harder to do. Our partners at the Gulbenkian Foundation conducted research with policymakers, politicians, citizens across the nation to understand this issue a little bit more. They did this about 3 years ago. And everybody was like, yes, there are issues of intergenerational unfairness going on. And yes, we would like to be more fair. But, future generations don't have a vote. We don't actually know what the future is going to bring. There's all these urgent crises and short-term issues that demand our attention. And once you start talking about intergenerational fairness and justice, it's very easy to get caught up in very destructive arguments that begin pitting one group against another. Like, okay, boomer. And so kind of facing this reality, this distance between our ideal and our true desires and this situation, we often kind of emotionally veer between two extremes. We have this very utopian hope that time and progress and technology is going to just magically fix the problems we create. Growth is the answer. And this more dystopian cynicism that says, well, we're all just really in it for ourselves. It's a dog-eat-dog world, survival of the fittest. And what is fairness anyway? Life isn't fair. And between those two extremes, we kind of fall into going, okay, this isn't really much we can do about. But actually, that sense is changing. Of course, as strategic foresight professionals, we pay a lot of attention to signals of change. And this one about intergenerational fairness has been climbing up the priority ladder quite significantly over the past decade. Really started noticing it after the financial crisis in 2008. And it's been amplified over time by growing awareness of climate change, and then boom, added a global pandemic. And all of a sudden, kind of intergenerational tensions begin to turn into the risk of open intergenerational conflict. Over this time period, younger generations have been getting much more vocal about the impact that they're seeing of our decisions in the past and today on their opportunities and their lives in the future after we're gone. And they've even begun suing their governments to establish their rights and the duty of care that the government has towards the future. So, for example, in April, Germany's Supreme Constitutional Court ruled that the government's climate protection measures are insufficient to protect future generations. Essentially, they sort of graded the homework a fail and handed it back and said, do better. And last month, just a few weeks ago, in what has been described as a global first, the Australian Federal Court ruled that the Environment Minister has a legal duty not to cause harm to the young people of Australia by exacerbating climate change when approving a coal mining project. So as these things bubble along and you see them rising up, you can understand why the political scientist Roman Krasnick writes, "We are in the midst of a historic political shift. It is clear that a movement for the rights and interests of future generations is beginning to emerge on a global scale." At the same time, we are slowly awakening, paying attention to the reality of huge demographic shifts towards an aging population in many parts of the world. We're living longer, we're having fewer children, and this equation is changing the economics of everything, of healthcare, pensions, growth, productivity. For example, another recent Gulbenkian report on intergenerational justice and public finances found that without taking any measures, the 2017 budget surplus in Portugal will turn into a permanent deficit as of 2030, leading to unsustainable public debt. So all of these forces are converging together to drive huge interest from politicians, policymakers, and citizens in this idea of intergenerational fairness. Many people are beginning to perceive an urgent imperative to move away from sort of battle lines of intergenerational conflict, injustice, and isolation, and drive towards greater intergenerational cohesion, solidarity, and harmony. So that people born at different times, looking out for each other, taking care of each other, very much in the way that we've done throughout the pandemic, where certain generations have limited their lives in order to protect other, more vulnerable generations. How do we transform this we're all in it together attitude across more aspects of our life? Next generations and future generations initiatives are emerging across the ecosystem. For example, in Wales, they have a Future Generations Commissioner. And these types of models are inspiring countries to develop new ways to represent future generations in the political system. But I think we also all know with these emerging changes, how do you keep this interest from just being a fad or a trend into actually being a substantive change? You know, this could just be kind of future generations in name only, a kind of lip service without accountability, good intentions to do well for the future without any actual scrutiny of the consequences of our decisions. And I think we all know that decision processes are very easily hijacked by short-term interests, the loudest voice in the room, and that strong faith that things are just maybe kind of generally going to work out okay in the end. So given all these dynamics, when the OECD released their landmark report on intergenerational justice last November, they very much challenged the policy community. They said, "We must consider the well-being of both future and living generations, integrating intergenerational considerations more systematically in strategy design and programming, building up foresight capacity to integrate a longer-term perspective in policymaking, encouraging dialogue, and increasing transparency and accountability about our policy choices." So that's the task at hand, but how do you do it? Well, this is something that we've been collaborating on with the Gulbenkian Foundation over the past 3 years to develop a methodology to evaluate public policies according to what is fair and unfair for all generations. See, I said we were going to get to policy assessment methodology. Over the course of doing this work, we've engaged with over 400 experts and communities around the world. We've tested the methodology on a series of live policy issues in Portugal and in the UK. And we very much use the lessons that we've learned in this development and piloting process as the foundation for our Intergenerational Fairness Observatory. Now, the framework that we've developed together will be a freely available tool published under Creative Commons license. That means that anybody can download it, adapt it, use it for non-commercial use. It can be applied by national and local governments, international organizations, ethical investors, foundations, and special interest groups, are just some of the possibilities. What's important to understand about the policy assessment tool, though, is it's embedded within a framework. It's not just a tool, so that's why we talk about the framework. And it's these three interlinked elements that make the policy assessment methodology practical, so you can kind of take it off the shelf, implement it right away in the short term, and also makes it adaptable to long-term changes in politics, culture, and demand. When we set out to design this policy assessment tool, we said we need to design one that can last for a generation or more. And so at its core, at the heart of this framework is national dialogue. And this dialogue ensures that the policies are being tested against the public's own views of what a desirable future looks like, using a rigorous, independent, participatory foresight process. And then kind of wrapped up all around the policy assessment tool and the dialogue is the institutional arrangements and ownership that hold it all together and give it legitimacy and accountability. The assessment process and the dialogue, they have to be close enough to policymaking and policymakers to have impact on their work, while still retaining a balance of political independence so that its findings can be trustworthy and so that it's got some teeth. Importantly, to both the framework and to this talk, the dialogue and policy assessment tool are structured through the principles of strategic foresight. We've embedded key principles and concepts like drivers of change, systems thinking, and alternative future scenarios into the process steps and into the formulation of the policy assessment questions themselves. So when you're following the methodology, you're using strategic foresight without necessarily needing to know that you're using strategic foresight. Within the policy assessment tool, when we're judging about whether a policy is intergenerationally fair or unfair, we look at it through 5 different lenses or questions. So we ask, does this disadvantage people at any particular life stage? So for example, does it have a disproportionate effect on preschoolers or retirees? Does it disadvantage people at any period in time, now or in the future? So we stretch the assessment over different time horizons across a number of different human and environmental domains. We ask whether this policy increases the chances of inequality being passed on through time. So from the systems thinking perspective, is it pushing the vectors and the levers that are going to increase inequality or decrease inequality? This one is very important. Does the policy restrict the choices of people in the future? Are we passing on debt and cost to people in the future, as well as tying their hands and limiting the decisions that they can make, their own agency and power control over their choices? And then finally, is this policy moving society further away from its vision for the future or closer towards? Prompts throughout the tool help the assessor scan for policy impacts that may indicate any of these facets of unfairness. And then impacts that are identified are explored in detail and stress tested against alternative future scenarios. The assessment also scrutinizes the policymaking process, because that can also be a source of intergenerational unfairness. Once a conclusion is reached, you can see there's kind of five verdicts that can be reached. The results are reported in a very accessible and engaging way. You've got simple reports that have a very strong, powerful message, but you also have nuance in the reports that helps you really understand what is the particular source of fairness or unfairness, and what are the specific policy recommendations that can help improve the situation. And these reports are designed to really bring intergenerational fairness into the national conversation and right up the political agenda. As part of the development process, we have stress tested the framework and the toolkit on live policy issues in Portugal and in the UK. The pilots were conducted by assessors with varied backgrounds. So for example, we've had constitutional lawyers, economists, auditors, local mayors, students, entrepreneurs, In the UK, with the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Future Generations, they've trained a group of citizens who've been looking at legislation as it goes through Parliament. So all sorts of different types of assessors and all sorts of different policy types, everything from emergency responses to COVID, national energy strategy, big infrastructure projects, questions of national security, agriculture, again, a whole range. Each assessing institution provided a team of at least 2 assessors who worked together so they could discuss, debate, and document their reasoning and judgment. And the completed assessments were peer-reviewed by experts, including some from the European Commission and the Future Generations Office in Wales. Importantly, we found that the methodology and tool works in real-world practice. Assessors could quickly learn how to use it with about 2 hours worth of training. They can then run through lots of different policy types and form a judgment on the intergenerational fairness of that policy. And they found that it added value to their existing work practices. So for example, if they were already required to do a risk assessment, they found that this helped them identify more risks and better risks, different risks than they would otherwise. So importantly, this methodology, it wasn't just a tick box activity that you just did to get through it, but doing it led to wider, deeper, and different thinking that actually changed minds. So in all of our pilot assessments, the final assessment was actually a bit different than what people assumed going into it. Sometimes it was a small shift, sometimes a big shift, but there was always a shift, which demonstrated to us that the tool did its job in terms of helping people think differently about the situation using these different lenses. And also these findings encourage us to believe that assessment methodologies like this can be adopted at scale to deliver substantive impact. This belief and the way that we're kind of deploying the tool is also informed by our theory of change. So based on a model created by the OECD, we highlighted that there are 3 key pressure points for influencing the political system. You can do it from inside the political system, outside from public debate, and internationally through global standards and agreements. And then within the political system, you can use the methodology when you're designing policy. So you're designing better policy by kind of iteratively testing it through a tool like this. You can use assessment to scrutinize policy as it's passing through the legislative process. And you can also use it to assess the impact of policy after it's been implemented. And really, to get maximum impact, you want to have assessment like this, these questions working kind of across this cycle so that you're driving increasingly better and more intergenerationally fair decisions over time. And although my talk and my examples focus a lot on assessing policy within the political system, the principles underlying it can apply to any type of strategic decision-making, particularly spending decisions and investment decisions by foundations, businesses, investors, because that's literally what an investment trying to do is you're trying to distribute costs and benefits over time. And here's a tool to better understand how you're doing that. Now, of course, policy assessment is only one part of the solution. It's a powerful one, but it's only part of the solution. And so at the Intergenerational Fairness Observatory, we're working across the system in different ways to incentivize decision makers to act in ways that are intergenerationally fair. To do this, we're going to need the right types of data, new institutions, new types of rights for citizens, future citizens, curriculum, and civic education about the future as well as about our past. But given this in our observatory, we're working to develop products such as metrics and standards that sit alongside our assessment tools. We're working to build networks, coalitions, and thought leadership in this area. We're helping increase knowledge and skills across individuals, organizations, and systems through training, accreditation, and international guidance. And we're shining light. We're going to be a beacon on challenging issues of intergenerational fairness by conducting our own independent impact assessments, national dialogues, and exemplar pilot innovations. Across this, we're hoping that we can contribute to building a democratic culture where longer-term and distributional issues are consistently taken into account, a truly anticipatory democracy, in the words of Alvin Toffler. So that is the end of my presentation. If you would, obviously we have time for chat and discussion. If you'd like to learn more, we have a website at swaf.org.uk/IGF, or just reach out directly to me at julie@swaf.org.uk to continue the conversation.
Hello, Julie. Can you see? You can now move the screen. Perfect. Okay, so we are waiting for the people to write some of the questions about the intergenerational fairness. It has a bit of a delay on the streaming.
Okay.
So we have one question in here. There, Antonio, you can see it on the screen.
Yes. Can the tool be applied in business context? Yes. We believe this can be used in business context very, very successfully. And we would love if people would like to try it out. Our tool is available for piloting in different contexts, so we can kind of stress test it and learn. So if anybody would like to try it out, please get in touch. But it can apply to any decision.
You have Erki Alto asking about what if time is a dimension?
Yes. So I'm not sure I exactly understand the question, but we look at time as a dimension in a couple of different ways, right? So we do look at the impact of a decision on different time horizons. So at the beginning of an assessment, you define what's the relevant time horizon for this policy. So for example, if you're looking at nuclear waste disposal, your long-term is going to be much longer than, for example, if you're looking at a COVID-19 employment measure. But regardless, we're asking people to push out the time horizon much longer than they would normally consider in the decision. And then also we look at the dimension of time through the vectors of transmission of inequality over time. So in the kind of the system, where the places in which inequality and unfairness starts to get kind of magnified disproportionately, and how does this policy interact with those levers? So we look at time from a few different angles.
And we have one that is pretty easy, and I believe you already answered. That is this tool online?
So it is not online yet because we're still in the piloting and the development phase. But if you are interested in trying it out, you can get in touch and we can arrange a pilot of it. And then it will be kind of online alongside the kind of how-to materials around it. And we'll be providing short training courses as well to help people get started on it.
And to finish, I think this is a tricky assessment, but I'm not sure. Look at Jules says that the UK does great futures work and takes future very seriously. Thank you. And then I'm thinking on the intergenerational fairness of the Brexit, for example.
That is definitely an issue that highlights some serious intergenerational questions in the political system. If you look at kind of the voting patterns and the people that'll be kind of most impacted by the decision long term who didn't have a vote or sufficient voice in the process, this could turn out to be a very, very serious intergenerational issue in the UK as it unfolds.
Yeah, so that's why I thought it was a tricky assessment or question. I'm not sure about that one, but thank you so much, Julie. I'm gonna put it here side by side. Sorry, I didn't say myself. Thank you so much, Julie, for being with us. It's super nice to think of the future as something that it's affecting different generations. I always believed that we are bound to the things that we live here, and we live things for the people that is going to live in that time. And our time is short here, but the things we do can last forever. So this intergenerational fairness is a super interesting framework, and asking those questions when we do everything, I think is really important for everyone. Actually doing anything, not only futures.
Exactly. Every time you do something, just pause and ask, is this fair to the future? Is this fair to different people alive today? And it's a good pause for thought.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Julie, again. And everyone else, you stay on the same page. It will be reloaded instantly with the next session in about 5 to 6 minutes. Thank you.